Hello and welcome to another episode of Tory Talks. I'm Sam. This is Councillor Ian Fisher.
Councillor Ian Fisher, thank you very much. Well, for another year at least.
Yeah, we'll see. And the date of recording is the 28th of August, so we're almost through August. Yay! And we're going to be talking about the voting age today. So I think the reason this prompted is because I saw an article that Layla Moran thought that you should be able to vote when you feel ready, and that would include 11-year-olds if they felt they were informed enough to vote. So I thought it might be an interesting discussion. So it always comes up during a build up to an election where we should reduce the voting age to 16. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on this, Ian.
So it would be good, I suppose, to give a bit of background to it and what people can and can't do now. So currently in a general election, obviously which is UK wide, the voting age is 18. Local elections are the responsibility of the devolved governments. So obviously the Scottish Government, Welsh Government, Northern Ireland Assembly, etc. can choose their own. I believe I'm right in saying that the Labour government in Wales has chosen to reduce the age to 16 for their local elections. So they did that recently, and they haven't actually had an election yet with that being the new voting age. I don't know what it is in Scotland. I think it's still 18 for local elections, and I don't think there's been any change in Ireland. But certainly I know there's a push in Scotland. I don't know if they actually enacted it or not. What are my thoughts? Well, it's a difficult one, really. I can understand the arguments for any age. Somebody could say 21, somebody could say 18, somebody could say 16, and probably put a convincing argument forward for any of them. But I'm a conservative. I'm not into change for change's sake. If somebody could explain to me the reason for wanting a change, then I could perhaps listen more to the reasons for what age they want to be able to vote. So I suppose what I mean by that is if a system isn't broken, and I don't see any reason to fix it, and it certainly seems to me at the moment that the people complaining about age aren't the people of that age. I don't see a huge raft of 16-year-olds clamouring for a vote. I see a huge raft of 20, 30 and 40 and 50-something-year-old politicians jumping around saying they want it, but they only want it for their own reasons. So my initial thoughts on this conversation are, is the system broken? Does it need changing?
And they're valid points. I mean, I thought about it because I've been dead against reducing the age of voting. Personally, I've always thought until recently that you shouldn't be able to vote until you're 21. I don't think you should be able to stand for election until you're 21 at the very minimum. So we discussed beforehand about how standing for election and voting should be the same age, and they are. So that means that if you were to reduce the age of voting to 16, that would also mean that candidates could be 16 standing. And personally, the idea of a 16-year-old being a decision maker terrifies the life out of me. But then the idea of some 45-year-olds who aren't informed at all also terrifies me. So I'm not sure whether the age thing is that much of an argument anymore. But it did make me think about all the differences between what you can do at 16 and what you can do at 18 anyway. And I was looking things up. You know, the age of consent is 16, and you can actually get married with your parents' consent at 16, but you can't vote until you're 18, and you can't drink until you're 18. And it's just such this, you know.
But isn't what you just said there a bit of a paradox? The marriage. So you can't marry at 16 without your parents' consent.
Well, without your
so in other words, you can't. So in other words, you can't get married at 16.
But you can have a baby at 16.
You can have but you can have a baby at 12. You can have a baby at, I mean, I don't know what the youngest is. I'd rather not think about it. But yeah, age is not a bar to that. Let's not get drawn into the fact that some countries allow child brides.
You can join a trade
That's a
union.
different Tory talks.
Yeah, I'm trying to move on. You can join a trade union at 16. Did you know that?
Well, I think I did, and I think that highlights a point that I was going to bring up in this. That, funnily enough, we think it's progressive. We think this is a progressive move, or certainly the politicians that are in favour of lowering the age seems to think it's a progressive move. My personal opinion is that it's actually a regressive move. We've moved a long way. My parents, I'm in my middle 40s, so my parents have both just become 70. So they're from a generation where lots of people left school at 15. They're from a generation where 75% of children were working at 16, working, earning, paying tax because the allowances weren't very high then. Now, in my personal opinion, it was probably more valid to have 16-year-olds voting in the 50s and 60s than it was now, because they took a much more active part in adult society. Tony Blair initiated the push for more people to go to university, and whether you agree with that or don't agree with that, again, that's another Tory Talks episode. We aimed for a 50% of children to be at university. We hit that. It started to decline a little bit, but obviously with this current pandemic, that's going to go through the roof. But there's a rule now, isn't there, that people of 16 and 17 have to be in full-time education or in an apprenticeship, which is partly like education. So there's this strange paradox that there's actually more of a clamour for young people to have the vote now, when actually less of them are taking part in adult society, probably than have done in the past 100 years. So, that doesn't ring true to me. That would mean that actually this is a backward step, giving children. I still class somebody who's 16 as a child. They still have to have their parents' consent. There are very few children that don't live with their parents, at 16. And do we want to be putting the weight of the world on their shoulders for having to choose who to vote? Now, I'm not saying this because younger people probably would predominantly vote a different way to me. That's by the by. It's not an issue as to why I necessarily think like that.
Yeah, and I used to think that, someone at 16, because they haven't lived, and that's why I always felt like it should be 21, because they haven't lived, they're not gonna get it, I guess. But ever since the hustings I went to, I went to a hustings in a school in Ipswich, and I spoke to a very, very grown up young lady afterwards, and she was really politically engaged, and we were talking for quite a while, and I thought, wow, I wouldn't know just by talking to her, if I wasn't looking at her, I wouldn't know that she was only 15. And then I was having a conversation this week with an 11-year-old who did a mock election in December, and she was telling me about her campaign that she was running at school and her passion about the environment and stuff. And I was talking to her, and she's only 11, and I thought, she's really engaged as well. And I had real meaningful conversations with these two young women who were very, very young. And it was more of an engaging conversation than I've had with some adults. So I'm not sure how I feel. I still feel like that it should be 21. Well, I certainly don't want it to be any younger, but that's not to say I've certainly changed my mind of the reasoning behind it, because there are a lot of young people that do know far more than, the average Joe that we come across. And we talk to a lot of people, don't we, canvassing, and there are, the argument that young people don't know anything about politics, I just don't think is much of an argument. But I still don't want to reduce the age.
Okay, well, it's difficult because I think you've fallen into a bit of a trap there. Well, not really a trap, but of course, people that are politically motivated are going to be, they're going to know their subject. A 12-year-old that's politically motivated is going to know more than a 40-year-old that isn't politically motivated. And that's always been the case and always will be the case. And yes, when you argue for anything, it doesn't, saying 16-year-olds can't vote doesn't mean there aren't some extremely intelligent 16-year-olds that would be able to base their vote on far better principles than somebody who's 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 or whatever age they are. But when you're creating blanket rules, you can't look at individuals. If I said to you, go to one of the PRUs in Ipswich, the people referral units, where all the children have been expelled from school, are probably suffering a little bit in their education, I say, and then tell me what you think of whether 16-year-olds should have the vote, you're going to come back with a completely different outlook to what you are going to a political hustings at an independent school where the only people that were going are going to be politically motivated. They wouldn't have had to drag people there. Go to a school assembly. Not that they'll be having any of them for a while, but go to a school assembly and see, and don't ask who puts their hand up. Ask those that don't put their hand up, because then you'll get what real 16-year-olds are like. And that's not me denigrating 16-year-olds or saying they're more intelligent or less intelligent now than they were however many years ago. I don't think they are. I do think that politics is becoming more mainstream in education. So there are probably more people doing, politics is a GCSE now. It never was when I was at school. To be fair, they did have GCSEs. I was the first year to do them. So I'm not that old. I'm not that old. They were still A to F then, rather than 1 to 9. But you didn't even do 1 to 9.
No, but I had A stars.
So yeah. Well, they didn't do A stars when I was there. I thought I got all A stars. I was hasten to add. But so no, I don't think it's any better or any worse. But I hark back to my previous point. Why change something that works? Now, a lot of people are saying, and this is the old hark back to the American War of Independence, no taxation without representation. So in other words, Boston tea traders were expected to pay tax but didn't have a vote. You could say the same thing. There is an argument that says, well, 16-year-olds can pay tax. I tell you what, somebody read me out the percentage of 16-year-olds that pay tax, and I'll be A, gobsmacked if that was anything more than 0.001, or B, even more gobsmacked if there was even any, because with the tax allowances being so high and the fact that you can't just leave school and work, you've got to be in either an apprenticeship or something, the thought of a 16-year-old earning more than a couple of £100 a week, which in other words would bring £244 a week you've got to earn before you pay tax. That's quite a big wage for a 16-year-old. So of course there are going to be some 16-year-olds that are paying tax, but not very many. In fact, a tiny percentage. Somebody could, if somebody was sitting in front of me to give me a compelling reason why they should, then perhaps I would understand it. But it seems to me to be a political stunt by one side of a political argument, because they believe that everybody who's that age will vote for them.
Yeah. And actually, I've asked quite a few 15, 16-year-olds, and this lass at the hustings, and I said to her, how comfortable would you feel about voting in a year or two's time when you're old enough to do it if they reduce the age? And she actually said she didn't feel like she would be old enough to make that kind of decision. So again, it was like, you're mega engaged, you know what you're talking about, and she agreed that because she hasn't lived the life where these decisions are going to be affecting day to day, she didn't feel comfortable with that. I wish her all the luck and success in the world, by the way, if she is listening to this. But yeah, it was quite an interesting one. But when we're coming on to the voting, Layla Moran, is it Layla or Lila?
Layla.
With her idea of being able to vote when you feel comfortable and ready to vote, my initial reaction was, you're bonkers. But then because we've had this discussion, you're saying there's people reach sort of a level at different ages, and because we have this blanket thing, is it that bonkers that she had this idea?
Well, yes, it is, because this is a very dangerous road to give down. It's a very conceited attitude to have, to say that only people that have got a full understanding of the process should be able to vote, because that will bar at least half the population from voting. You know, and I'm not being nasty. There's a massive amount of people that don't really necessarily, you've knocked on enough doors to know that quite often people don't even know what the election is they're going for. They just go and they put an X in the box. So the next step on from her policy would be that you'd have to sit a test before you're eligible to vote. Now, personally speaking, I don't necessarily think that's the worst thing in the world.
Knew you were going to say that.
But that's not democratic. Democracy is an important thing, and if you're intelligent, right, you're likely to maybe think, oh, well, thick people shouldn't get the vote. But why shouldn't they? Why shouldn't they get the vote? Why shouldn't somebody that doesn't know, person A has got just as much right as person B to vote, regardless of whether, person A knows what he's voting for and person B does. It doesn't matter. The whole point of democracy is that you don't always get the results you want, and sometimes you might look at it and think, a lot of the world think that America was crazy to vote Trump. I personally don't, but they voted Trump. It doesn't mean, some of the people of the world think we were crazy to vote Brexit, but we voted Brexit. It's not about vote. It's about what you want in there, not necessarily always what you want up there. So intelligence and awareness shouldn't necessarily be the what we use to decide who can vote. And Layla Moran, let's not forget who Layla Moran really is. Layla Moran believes that you should be able to self-identify as anything. So which isn't she one of the reasons why Piers Morgan called himself a penguin for a while? Because didn't she think that if you wanted to self-identify as a 55-year-old man, then you should be able to self-identify as a 55-year-old man. If I wanted to self-identify as an 18-year-old woman, then I should be able to self-identify as an 18-year-old woman.
Which I think you love.
Listening to this crazy woman say, 11-year-olds should have the vote if they're clued up enough. Who's going to decide that? Themselves? Their parents? Mm-hmm. Who's going to decide that? You're going to have to sit an 11 plus. You're going to have to sit an exam. And, there are some crazy political ideas I've heard in the past. That is one of the more crazy. In simple terms, you should really have a system that's as simple as possible. Having devolved administration, some people might think is really, really wonderful, but actually, do you know what? All it does is create a whole level of confusion, and all that's going to happen in Wales is you're going to have a whole level and group of people that get, I can vote in this election, but I can't vote for this. I can, in real terms, what you've created in Wales, or what the Welsh politicians have created in Wales, is a system where a 16-year-old can go and vote for a councillor that's going to decide their policy on their highways, on adult social care, on bins, on economic development, and all things like that. But they're not allowed to go and vote for an MP. So what they're basically saying is that local matters don't really matter as much as national matters. And you just added a whole level of confusion in there, because now the question is, for that 16-year-old person that's politically engaged, why can they vote in one election but not in another? So how can anybody answer that question? What gives politicians the right to be messing around with a system that works? And I often think that some of these devolved administrations, and to be honest, Nicola Sturgeon, and I know it's slightly off topic, but Nicola Sturgeon's done an amazing thing through this pandemic. But some of these devolved administrations do things because they just want. There are only a few things that they're allowed to do different from the UK government. And sometimes they do them just because they can.
Yeah.
Look what we can do with our power. Okay. And Nicola Sturgeon's been doing that very, 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 very well. Politically, she's eaten Boris Johnson alive, because she'll come out with things that she knows he doesn't like, but she knows might resonate with the public. And then a week or so later, when Boris Johnson realises it's resonating with the man, and do a U-turn and say, oh, masks in schools. This might have to have some mileage. And then Nicola Sturgeon just gets another political win. So, don't get me started on devolved administrations and people creating political decisions just so they can show people that they've got some power.
I won't.
A wise choice.
How do you feel now you've got that off your chest?
Well, to be honest, it's what I felt for a while, and this goes to the root of the whole argument. Okay, decisions like this shouldn't necessarily be taken by politicians. It's a bit like I've done an interview earlier on this week with the independent remuneration panel, looking at councillors' pay.
I'm glad you've got to say
that. Yeah, because we don't vote for our own pay. Because one, you shouldn't ever vote for your own pay, but two, it puts a real horrible onus on a councillor to do that. And there are some things that should be decided by people that aren't necessarily political, because let's face it, every socialist or person that is from a left-leaning party is going to say, yay, let 16-year-olds vote, not because they think it's sensible, but because they think it's going to score them more X's in the ballot box. And every right-leaning politician is going to say, oh, no, don't do that. And not because it's not sensible, but because they don't want to have an X in all the opposition's ballot boxes. So really, a group should be looking at this that are perhaps apolitical, because the decision needs to be one that isn't taken by politicians. You can't trust politicians with everything, you know. Which is why we have an independent. Anything. This is why we have an independent boundary commission, because they look at the boundaries independently, and knowing full well that any change that they bring in is going to affect one group disproportionately to the other. And that's why you have to. The only way to enact anything like this would be to have an independent vision. So have an independent group look at this from time to time and let them make recommendations. But don't give this decision to politicians who are only going to vote based on what's good for themselves rather than what's good for the people that you're discussing.
Well, on that subject, we probably can't talk about who else we think should or shouldn't have the right to vote, because you want it to just go to an independent body.
Well, no, because there are other groups where it isn't so obvious, Sam. So I know on the agenda we were looking at, should prisoners have the vote? Now, to be honest, I don't think anybody knows what, or anybody would even hazard a guess as to, and I don't even think it would fall one way. Prisoners don't necessarily all vote in one way. So it isn't so much of a political decision as do 16 to 18-year-olds get the vote.
Yeah.
So should prisoners get the vote? Because I'm guessing that's what you're alluding to.
Yeah.
I'll let you go first because you usually hear my opinion first.
No, I don't think. I think if you are in prison, you should not be able to vote. So, yeah, because I think if you've done a crime that has resulted in you ending up incarcerated because you can't live by the rules of our society, then you should not play a part in deciding future rules. So whilst you're in prison, you should not be able to vote.
In any election?
In any election.
Including the Police and Crime Commissioner?
Especially the Police and Crime Commissioner. No, I just think, there has to be some form of punishment. And if, like I say, if you can't be part of our civilised society and you can't abide by our rules, you certainly should not be, in that moment of punishment, able to have a say in any future rules.
Okay, but would you say that regardless of the crime, once that person had served their sentence, that they were entitled then to come back and have a vote?
Yes. So once they've served their sentence, okay. So this is part of the punishment, I would say.
So I think it's then quite important to distinguish that because, let's say somebody, so last election was, what was it? was it November or December now? I can't actually remember the date of it. December. Okay. So somebody gets sentenced in October of last year. They get sent to jail for 2 years, which means that they'll be out in 1 year, which under your rules would preclude them from voting. They're going to come out in October 2020, and potentially they're going to live under a government which they haven't had any say in voting for the next 4 years until the next election.
Correct.
So do you not think that rather than a blanket ban, it should be done on, if your length of service takes you past the election after the one you're currently voting on, then you don't get a vote. But if your sentence is due to finish between when the current election is and the next one, then you should get a vote. How about that? Because you are going to return to society. You're going to be expected, and this is a big thing with me, because when I was in recruitment, I did have quite a lot of exposure to criminals, and we used to do a lot of work with criminals, like trying to get them back into work when they're when they're leaving prison. Because my thoughts are on it is that we need to do more as a society to welcome back people to society after they've had a time away from it. That's not to say that I don't think that some sentences are way too short, but that's a different matter altogether. But I think it's very important that if somebody serves their sentence that is handed down to them, that they have full rights the day they leave incarceration. And taking away their right to vote in an election would strip that away. And I don't necessarily think that should be. I do think, which is not very right wing of me, I do think that we should perhaps look at changing the rules to allow those people whose sentences are going to come to an end relatively soon, perhaps after, maybe not somebody whose sentence comes to an end 2 months before an election, so for 5 years they've been in jail, but if there's somebody that's going to come out a short period, whether that be a couple of months, a year or two, whatever, I don't know, a short period after the election, that they should be able to vote, because in real terms they're voting for something, for a government that's going to have a massive say on them when they try and rejoin society.
I can see where you're coming from. And if we were to have all elections on all tiers at the same time as a general election, it just all mirrored, then I would probably still disagree, but I would see where you're coming from more. But we do have regular elections. It's not as if it's like, it's going to be potentially 5 years until they have a say on anything.
It's 5 years. It's Sam. A general election is 5 years. We've had some weirdness over the last couple of years, but a general election is 5 years.
Yeah, but general election. But we're talking about, we have other elections. So that's what I'm saying. If all other elections coincided with a general election, I can see your point. Whereas you're only talking about one vote in a general election.
Yeah, but just remember, Sam, that although I agree with you, there are lots of elections. It's only sad political geeks like you and I that get excited about the other elections. That's why the turnout for a lot of local elections is 25%, because most people don't bother. So, yes, there are lots of elections, but the one that really counts for people is the general election. But it's a difficult one, because at the time of the election I'm with you. They're not considered part of mainstream society, and they shouldn't. And they shouldn't have the good bits that mainstream society brings you. But see, my concern is that by having a blanket ban, what you're actually doing is extending the sentence for a group of prisoners.
Sorry, that's my daughter.
Are you going to about to have a child walk into the shop?
Put some clothes
on. So yeah, it's almost like an extension of the sentence. somebody does, let's say somebody came out of jail in March of this year, shit out really, because I go straight back into lockdown. But let's say they came out in March this year. They've had 4 months being inside under the Conservative government of Boris Johnson, but they could potentially have 4 years and 8 months living under a government which they had no say in voting in. So yeah, I do think something needs to be looked at.
But do you think?
I don't know.
Do you think there should be some form of rights when it comes to voting for people that have had to do a custodial sentence?
What? Whilst they're in jail, I don't think they should have the right to vote. At all. Blanket. 100%. And would never change that. They've broken the rules of society. They don't need to be taking part in a democracy, in a democratic process. No. But the very nature of democracy is that everybody should have a say. And if they are going to be a big proportion of what you're voting for is going to be when they're out of jail, then I do think there's something to look at. Yeah, I do think it's something to reconsider, but I certainly wouldn't consider giving prisoners the right to vote. Not at all.
No.
Not at all.
No, so we're kind of on the same page. You're just making it a little bit more complicated than it needs to be.
No, I'm being serious about it. It's easy for a Conservative to say, no, don't bother with that. Don't bother. And it doesn't necessarily go with my right-wing persona that I put across, but having spent so much time with people that have just left prison, I'm just so well aware that the system is just stacked so much against them, and the system, in the way the system is at the moment, just means you get repeat offenders and they go back inside. So unless we make some positive change, our prison population will be in record numbers for years to come. That's that's a different matter altogether. Yeah. So, do we have on a related topic, Miss Murray? Do we have time to briefly discuss postal voting?
We can do if you want to do it. Can I just have a quick chat with my my children and get them to be a little bit quieter?
I don't think a quick chat is what it's called, Sam. We weren't talking about you, honestly.
I think you were.
Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
Good.
So, Lily, I'll ask you a question.
Right.
If you're in prison, if you go to prison, should you be able to vote?
Yes.
Yay! See?
Yes.
Lily says yes.
No.
You can't change your mind. You've said yes now.
That's a trick.
That was a trick.
And Lily, another thing, you don't have to hold the microphone when you're speaking in it.
Yes, I do.
And you don't have to eat it either.
But I'm not
Do you reckon this is how coronavirus started?
Yeah.
Right. Go on then. Are you going to tell us about postal voting?
Yeah.
No?
Yeah.
Right. So, postal voting. What do you want to discuss on postal voting?
Oh, your thoughts on postal voting, your thoughts on the current system, and maybe your thoughts on how it may affect the upcoming American elections and how it might still affect next year's elections should social distancing still be in place.
So, okay, so my thoughts on postal voting since our last Tory Talks is that they should be restricted to purely people who have a medical need for it. So they shouldn't be able to postal vote unless you simply can't get to a polling station. I personally would change the whole system anyway, so it was compulsory to vote. But that's probably never going to happen. And I think the elections most definitely should go ahead regardless of whether there's a pandemic or not, and it should just be socially distanced. So I would restrict the postal voting, and I would also make people fill in their ballot papers in pen instead of the little pencils you get.
So definitely, I like the idea of compulsory voting. I've always liked the idea of compulsory voting. I believe it's compulsory in Australia, and they do issue fines for those that don't vote. I do think we use an extremely archaic system at the moment for voting, which is open to abuse. And I do think that there are potentially ways to update the system. And I probably agree that postal voting shouldn't be open to everybody, because the more postal ballots you get, the more allegations there are of wrongdoing. And allegations of wrongdoing are never good for a fair election. You know, I actually I cannot think for one moment that there won't be mass legal challenges to the American election. I know it's the American election, it's not in the UK, but to be fair, they usually have a quite in-depth legal challenges to the American election anyway, because of the weird systems they use. But this time, with such huge, and we're talking huge numbers, registering to vote by postal ballot, and they have a very similar system to us, where it's open to abuse. I think it's undoubted that in a lot of these swing states, it's going to be quite close, and I just think that there's going to be a huge number of people that allege that wrongdoing has taken place. See, the problem with postal ballots is that it's so easy to make an allegation that something is wrong, whether it is or it isn't, because it's impossible to prove the system works, and it's too open to abuse. So all you'll really do by enlarging postal ballot system is give the losing side more of an opportunity to challenge a decision.
I agree. Oh, and another thing I didn't mention is I would extend the voting for a couple of days, a few days, maybe 3.
Well, see, that's one of my thoughts. Is that some of the systems that I've considered that could be used in the past don't really work very well with the system we have, where you have an election all over one particular day, gets counted, and then gets the results come in later that night or the next morning. I hark to the fact that we use the internet for a lot of things. Now, if we use the internet to pay for financial transactions, then there's a lot of security on the internet. But you're still not going to get over the fact that in a family of 6 people, I could coerce the other 5 into I'll vote for you. So even the most secure system, unless it's something that's done in person. Now, this is where I think we need to get back. You see, in some countries where democracy isn't a given, and where they've had to fight hard recently for democracy, you see them queuing for days to vote. And you see them voting. Afghanistan's a fine example. They'll queue for days and days and days to have their say, because they've never previously been able to have their say. They get indelible ink put on their finger, so they can't vote twice. What's more simple than that? And it's sad to say that system is less open to abuse than ours.
Yeah, I agree. And also, and the reason I'm quite strongly opinionated when it comes to compulsory voting is because people always say things like referenda aren't necessarily democratic because of the turnout and everything else. And you can say, well, actually, any form of election or vote that we have in this country could be argued that it's not democratic. I've lost 2 elections, as my son keeps highlighting to me, and I've potentially lost against someone who has got, say, 15% of the vote in this area. How can that be the case? If such a low turnout, even the people that win, can they honestly say that they're there through true democracy when hardly anyone turned out to vote for them?
Well, true democracy. Well, it is true democracy. everybody was entitled to a vote. Some people chose to exercise that right. Some people chose not to. And the person with the most votes won. To try and argue to me that that isn't true democracy.
Well, with Remainers, they're always banging on about,
Yeah,
oh
but
well,
like I say,
it's 17 point. Well, yeah, I know what you're saying there, but it's 17.4 million people voted. But if you look at the population who can
yeah, but
legally vote,
don't just give numbers. Try and think of an argument that says that that isn't democracy. Allowing everybody the right to vote, giving everybody the choice of who they vote for, and then them choosing whether they A, vote or not, or B, vote for which particular party. Because in your argument, or in your statement, and I know that wasn't necessarily your argument, in your statement then, that presumes that those that didn't vote would have voted A certain way, or B, thought that somebody was worth voting for. An awful lot of people that don't vote because, one, they don't want any of those people to win. You speak to people that don't vote in local elections and they'll say, well, they're all the same. They're all in it for themselves. So that is democracy. Having a 60-70% turnover is democracy. Now, is it more democratic, the Australian system, where voting is compulsory? Forcing somebody to do something, is that more democratic than allowing people the choice?
Well, I guess so long as there is the ability to score through your paper, then I think it would still allow you to have a choice. So none of the above. Then at least you're physically going there. It can't be the argument that there wasn't enough of a turnout. If you've turned out and then you've still scored through your paper, then it's still showing that you've had a choice.
It's only ever the losing side in an argument that speaks throughout the turnout, which tells you why it's a Trojan horse of an argument, really, because it's only the losing side. Nobody wins an election and says, but there was only 67% turnout, so I didn't really win. So it's a moot point. It's nobody in this country is forced to not vote, and nobody is forced to vote. And there are enough options available to people, i.e. postal ballot, voting by proxy, or voting in person. There are enough options which allows anybody, regardless of your health, your condition, whatever, or even where you are. You can vote in an election and be in the Maldives. You can give your vote to somebody by proxy. So when we have a system that does make it as easy as it possibly can do for people to vote, then no, it should, turnout is irrelevant.
So because why are you in favour of compulsory voting then?
I like compulsory voting. I actually think that if you brought in a system of compulsory voting, within a generation or two, you would eliminate a lot more of the don't cares.
Yeah.
Because knowing that they would have to physically go there and vote for one or whatever would probably mean that they would actually read some of the literature or do some research. So I think that everybody should vote. And if the only way of making that is to make it compulsory, then that's the way to be. But I actually think that if you made it compulsory, you'd probably only need to make it compulsory for a couple of generations. And then by nature, everybody would.
Yeah.
If you look back in history and look at the numbers that voted after different sections of society were actually given the vote, a lot of those numbers are quite high, because obviously people, and that's why you see huge queues in countries like Afghanistan, because if you've taken that ability away from somebody for a long time, by nature they're going to want to do it. So yeah, but again, I like compulsory voting because I think it would make us as a society think more about the candidates who are actually putting themselves up for election.
Yeah, I agree. That was another one of my thoughts as well, but I chose the thing that was at the forefront of my mind because of a discussion I'd had this week. A heated discussion, I might add.
Yeah, I mean, the long and short of it is that there's just far too many people that don't that see that it doesn't matter to them. And the saddest indictment to me is that in the local elections, because even in a switched on area, you know, some of the areas of Ipswich that are the most switched on, they only get, you know, places like St Margaret's, they only get 44%, and that's considered to be a brilliant turnout in the local election. But it's being a local councillor and knowing how hard most councillors work, and how much most councillors have got the real interest of their town at heart. I do actually think people should actually take the trouble to go out and vote, because I think not doing so just shows that they're not involved in their community, and they see no community or necessarily their local society. And the more people that are switched on to that locally, the better each local area would become.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's actually a really good note to end on, actually, that you're right. More people need to go out to vote. We take democracy for granted. And if you don't care about who's representing you, then are you really putting yourself out there in society as well? We should take our vote more seriously. Right, well, it's been a pleasure. I'm going to go and have
As always,
a stiff drink after going to Cllr's today and daylight robbery.
I've got to get back on the phone, unfortunately.
Well, I'll speak to you next week.
Cheers, thank you, bye.